special Jones and Company program is being brought to you by the Ministry of Financial Services, Trade and Industry.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Wendell Jones, and welcome to this special program on JCN and Love 97 as we talk about world trade. The Bahamas is set to become a member of the World Trade Organization. And for many years, we have been talking about it, and there have been commissions appointed. The various people have been negotiating. And today on our program, we are going to learn more about what it means to be a member of WTO. And many people question whether or not we should be a member of the World Trade Organization. We have guests on our program today. Mr. Zhivargo Laing, who is a former minister of the government of the Bahamas, but currently the chief executive officer of the Government and Public Policy Institute at the University of the Bahamas. And he's also now the chief negotiator for the Bahamas. And I believe Mr. Laing has just returned from Switzerland. It is a pleasure to have him on our program today, Mr. Laing. Thank you for being here. Also here today is attorney Paul Moss, who has been working in international trade and offshore banking and many other services in our country, indeed in the financial services sector. Paul Moss, it's good to have you here today.
Good to be here.
And Godfrey Ines, who has been an ambassador of the Bahamas to the Food and Agriculture Organization, former president of BAMSI, and he himself has been a member of various trade committees. Mr. Ines, good to see you here today.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
And let us begin our conversation with Mr. Laing. As I said, you have just returned from Switzerland, I believe, representing the Bahamas. Where are we in becoming a member of the World Trade Organization?
You know, when I give, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to be here and to see all of you. When I make presentations to groupings, I like to use a chart that says that if you have a 5-step process in this negotiations, we are at the end of step 1.
Step 1?
That's where we are.
Wow.
Essentially because the process of it is that you make the application. The WTO sets up a working party. That's the group in the World Trade Organization, group of countries that are responsible for essentially shepherding your application process. And following upon that, you submit what is called a memorandum of trade regime. It is a detailed description of how you trade, how your economy works. And essentially, what typically happens is the initial process is one really of members of the WTO seeking clarifications to better understand how you trade. And we were at that place 7 years ago. We are now at that place again because having stalled it and people having changed in the diplomatic community, you are now reintroducing yourself to a new group of people responsible for the trade negotiation process. So when I would have gone to Geneva, it was essentially a question of sitting with a group of people, with the team, and answering questions about the trade regime itself, the factual summary about the trade regime, getting clarifications, and then following upon that, they would submit some of those questions, most of those questions or additional questions in writing to you, and so now you have to go back. So no hard negotiations have taken place at all yet.
But should we become a member of the World Trade Organization?
Well, you know, I submitted the Bahamas' application for membership in the WTO in 2001 when I was Minister of Economic Development.
17 years ago?
17 years ago. Everything about my training, my experience, my understanding of how our economy works, how the WTO works, what the benefits are, says to me that it is useful for the Bahamas to do so. I'm not the only one who believes that. In fact, if you look at the National Development Plan draft, it says in section 13 of that draft that amongst the things that the Bahamas ought to do was to sign on to additional bilateral and multilateral agreements, including the World Trade Organization, and outlining the reasons for that. And so it is, to my mind, something that as a part of the strategic economic growth and development prospects of the country, the Bahamas ought to do.
Paul Moss, where are you in terms of the Bahamas being involved in world trade and joining the World Trade Organization?
Well, my group, which is Bahamians agitating for a referendum on free trade, is not opposed to free trade, but we believe that the World Trade Organization is much more than trade. And so it changes so many things that it is so fundamental that Bahamians ought to speak to it by way of a referendum. It cannot be that the government of the Bahamas seeks to pull this thing to themselves and make a determination that would be so catastrophic for the rest of the Bahamas that the Bahamians don't have a say. If the Bahamas goes that route and the Bahamian people choose to take it, I'm fine with it. But I know that Godfrey Enyas, who has been an agriculturalist for many years, his industry would be absolutely decimated should the Bahamas join on to the World Trade Organization, because agriculture is something that has been heavily subsidized by many countries who are members of that organization, and it remains now that they are able to bring fruits and vegetables to these shores at a price that we cannot even produce at. Therefore, I think that if we look across the spectrum, many areas that currently have been reserved for Bahamians would be in jeopardy. And I think that if people actually knew that that would happen, they'll be up in uproar, because right now, broadcasting that you have here today, this is something that's been reserved for Bahamians. Newspaper, like you're a newspaper man, that's been reserved for Bahamians. If you allow others to come into these shores who've had access to capital, access to all of these things, I think that there would be a strain on businesses such as yours and on the economy of Bahamians.
What is interesting about what Paul is saying is that if you look at the accessions that have taken place of late, you can find in those accessions any number of the reservations which he now suggests can't happen. The truth is, that's why you are having negotiations. And I might add that the Bahamas is having those negotiations at a time where the WTO itself needs the kind of publicity, you might say, the goodwill that comes from a Bahamas or others joining the WTO, so your leverage becomes even more significant. In terms of agriculture, with the greatest respect, agriculture is actually one of the areas where, as you examine the World Trade Organization countries, our support of agriculture is woefully below what these other countries do. So we have more room to maneuver in agriculture than probably in any other sector there is. So there is nothing the Bahamas does in agriculture today that is non-compliant with the WTO.
That is true.
It could do more, in fact.
It is true. It is compliant because we allow so many fruits and vegetables to come into the country that we do not allow infant industries of our farmers to be able to participate, to grow up their industries, to actually have an opportunity.
Actually, we do. We have high protective tariffs for any number of the sensitive items. There are about 29 of them that we have. If you look at the 6,000 plus items
I'm just
import
talking,
and export,
let's talk.
there are 29 items we designate as sensitive from the farmers. These are the ones we produce here at home, which they have to compete with imports. And if you look at our tariff structures, they are protective for those sectors. And as we negotiate, we aren't seeking to remove those protections. In fact, we are seeking to ensure that where the Bahamas can, it provides greater WTO compliant subsidies and provisions for those sectors.
One of the things I would say is that when you look at the nature of the WTO, the idea is not to have reservations, it's to have free flow, free trade. And what is being suggested here is that there is a mechanism to permit us to continue to have business as usual. I submit that That's absolute nonsense.
Well,
Not going to happen.
well, it's what I would say to you is, and as I say to you, to the groupings as we meet with them, there's no question that you can't go to the WTO and say I want to join and continue as is everything you have. But what you do have is you have benchmarks. There's no question that there are benchmarks in the Seychelles and Vanuatu and others who have joined who have reservations. Why? Because the WTO has a developing country mechanism that allows it to pay attention to what it regarded as certain sensitivities in relation to some segments of your economy. And this is the negotiation. What I find sometimes surprising is these are negotiations. So we are suggesting that you're going into negotiations and things are a fait accompli, but they're not. You can decide, well, I argued with you, I negotiated with you, you told me that I have to open up everything, and well, but I can't live with that. So thank you very much. It's been a good process talking to you, and I'm leaving. And that is the process that we are in.
Well, that's, well.
Let me get in here a minute, John. What concerns me is the broader issue, Mr. Laing. The WTO is a 23-year-old organization. Started in 1995 as a GATT morphed into the WTO. The big countries, the US, China, Japan, the European Union, particularly the three Western countries, are dissatisfied with the way that the WTO is operating. There's a great deal of dissatisfaction, particularly since the introduction in 2001 of China, because the modus operandi of the Chinese is the basis for the trade war, right? And so the European Union, Japan, and America are in the process of making a case to renegotiate how the WTO operates. What has been your experience in Geneva to that?
I think if you look in the academic community, if you look in the economic community, if you look in the diplomatic community of the WTO, there's a recognition by all of them that the WTO needs reform.
Yeah.
Right? But you can make that case for any number of things. We need reform in our courts, we need reform in our education system, but you don't throw them away. There is a recent publication of a piece of writing that says that the structures of the WTO are sound, but the reform is necessary. And I think that that's the tune that you are hearing. It's not an abandonment of what the WTO seeks to achieve in terms of world trade and the rules of trade. It is a understanding that some of there has to be reform of the WTO. What is unique with respect to the WTO is there has not been a completed round of the WTO since the 8th round. And why has that been the case? Because the developing countries have said, no, until this happens, we're going to further. Yet people argue that these are institutions where the developed countries have all the power.
Yes.
The U.S. and those have their issues. Not the. I wouldn't necessarily say the U.S. itself in terms of the administration. There are some personalities in the U.S. that might have some issues. The Europeans are less so, and what have you. But what they are arguing is they don't get to do in the WTO what they get to do in the United Nations, which is
because the WTO is not a democratic organization.
well, I would suggest to you that it's more so.
No, sir.
It's more so to this extent. It's more so to this extent, as I just finished indicating, right? God, all you have to do is ask yourself the question: when was the last round of the WTO?
Uruguay or
That's right.
yeah.
Many years ago. Yeah. Why? A United States of America being a dominant force in a non-democratic institution cannot force a round? No.
Well, the President of the United States is always criticizing WTO.
Yeah, but he has.
As a matter of fact, he says that he's considering coming out of WTO. Then you have the Brexit, the problems that you have in Europe now with the European Union. So we have a state of flux, really, in world trade, don't we?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think, I think it's necessary to appreciate who is sounding what. In the United States of America, you have a president who personally for years has had his issues with global governance and has expressed that. When the President of the United States put the steel tariffs on, I dare you to Google search the remarks of the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, and congressmen across the board. They were all opposed to it. And you cannot leave the WTO except the Congress agrees it. The President of the United States cannot make that decision. The President of the United States cannot, on his own, ratify a global trade agreement. And the European Union, UK left Brexit.
I'm not too sure.
But not the European Union.
I'm not too sure.
No, that's a fact.
Donald Trump has pulled out of the of NAFTA. He has pulled out of the French.
No, he hasn't pulled out of NAFTA. He has renegotiated NAFTA. Now has to go to the Congress to have it ratified.
They went to Paris and negotiated climate change, and he's pulled out of that.
But that was an executive function that was exercised by him in his exclusive domain. He can't do that on trade.
Well, you know.
That doesn't mean he can't convince the Congress and the Senate to go along with it. I'm just saying it's a little more of a journey than.
Mr. Laing, look at what he's done on trade with China.
Yeah, but
there are a whole lot of congressmen who disagree with him with respect to how he's raised tariffs on China.
But he can do that in his executive function. But what is interesting on what he's done on the steel tariffs is this: he argued that the Chinese were in breach of the WTO rules, and if you believe and if you agree that you have been offended by the rules of the WTO, you can take action. What did the Chinese do? The Chinese took action in accordance with the rules. $125 billion worth of tariff for $125 billion worth of tariff, all within the rules of the WTO.
But
not a war.
The tariffs that he implements ought to have come after they've had a dispute resolution at the WTO. What he has done is bypass all of that.
No, there's no
bypass all of it.
No, there's no. You don't have to go to the
But it's obvious you don't have to go
dispute settlement mechanism. No, the dispute settlement mechanism is something that the disputing parties oblige after they have agreed, or someone has agreed that they have been offended.
And so you're making a point that Wendell has made, that the President of the United States is not obliged to go through, to be concerned himself with his Congress, simply because in Latin it's called de jure and de facto.
Yeah.
De facto means that I am essentially pulling out by doing what I want to do, i.e. I'm not going to the dispute resolution. I am going to put tariffs on you.
Except that would be fine if in every material sense you have affected your relationships with all the parties with whom you have this agreement. And in the WTO, the membership obligations, most favored nation status, the national treatment, that has not been dismantled in the United States of America by America. It was targeted at a single player in the WTO.
But let me point this question, this issue regarding the modus operandi of China.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Two things. The big objection why they want to have a revisit of the WTO is because China is allowing state-owned entities, all right, to compete with the private sector. That is what is happening, Mr. Laing, and that's happening here. Wait, that's happening here because, wait, let me make the point. That is happening here.
But Dr.
Let me finish now.
Yeah, okay.
That is happening here. That's one thing. That is happening here, right? Z&S is competing with private broadcasting.
Yeah.
They get $11 million a year.
Mr.
Right?
Jones doesn't object to that.
said
I mean, doesn't object to moving that. He doesn't.
Yeah.
I say you don't object to moving that. I remember being on your show many times where you said it's unfair.
Oh.
It's unfair. I'm saying you don't object to a process that would dismantle the state competition with you.
No, I don't.
Right. And let me give you another point, right?
Yeah.
China has made it mandatory that if you want to engage or have access to the economy, right, you have to turn over your technology to them. All right?
Yeah, no,
We don't require that here. We don't say that
Doc-
if you want to come invest in the
Doc-
Bahamas,
Doc-
you got to turn over your technology to us, right?
Dr.
That is part of China's
Dr. NES,
modus operandi, right?
I have spent considerable time examining what is happening at the WTO, et cetera, and I can tell you, it may well be what you say, but that is not the reason why the Americans have issues with the
that's
Chinese.
one of the reasons.
The main and particular reason that this particular American president has had issues with China is exactly where you saw him target his tariff.
Well, that's part of
And
it.
you could not know. You trace the politics of it. But there is a particular reason
but the Europeans-
that he has done that.
The Europeans and the Japanese have difficulty without the Chinese.
Yeah, but the
operating.
Europeans, I sat at the table with the Europeans recently, sat at the table with El Salvador, sat at the table with the United States of America, and if they are leaving the WTO, ain't nobody tell them
I'm
people.
not saying they're leaving.
So-
they want reform because
Exact-
they're
no,
opposed
but
to
that-
the way
but that-
China is operating.
But I mean,
That's what I'm saying.
What is interesting though is, this life, hey, they negotiated recently with the Chinese to exceed the WTO,
What was that?
The members of the World Trade Organization. When we put in our application, China was in the process, and you know what made our application difficult to precede China was that the fear is what you do for this small country may be of a developmental
2001.
concession, but it would then now apply to a China.
2001.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take a break here. We are talking WTO today, the World Trade Organization. And when we return, we're going to talk about our national interest, whether or not it is in the national interest of the Bahamas right now to accede to WTO rules. We'll come right back.